Grenada, a small island nation with a rich history, shaped by the hands of men who dared to dream big. But few figures in Grenadian history are as divisive as Eric Gairy. To many, he was a champion of the working class, a visionary who led Grenada to independence. To others, he was a dictator, ruling with an iron fist. But before the politics, before the power, who was Eric Gairy? And how did he rise from humble beginnings to become the most influential leaders in Caribbean history? Eric Matthew Gairy was born on February 18, 1922, in the rural parish of St. Andrew, Grenada. His parents, Douglas and Teresa Gairy, were working-class Grenadians who understood the hardships of colonial life. From a young age, Eric was ambitious.
Yes, he
Yeah.
was a hero to me. He went to school together with my mother. Schoolmates in same class, they went to school together. Yeah. He just came out from out of the blues because he didn't even went to go to secondary school.
He didn't go to secondary school.
Nope. But he was very smart and he was very ambitious. When he came back, he got interested in politics.
Oh, I see.
And he was particularly sympathetic about people living in poverty.
His early education took place at St. Andrew's Roman Catholic School, where he quickly distinguished himself as a bright and determined student. But despite his intelligence, higher education was out of reach for many in Grenada at the time, and like many young men of his generation, he sought opportunities abroad. Gairy spent time in Aruba, working in the oil industry, where he saw firsthand how labor exploitation affected the Caribbean workforce. When he returned to Grenada, he became a teacher, an experience that further exposed him to the struggles of the working class. But teaching alone wasn't enough. He had a vision of change, and in 1950, he took his first major step toward it by forming the Grenada United Labour Party, GULP. His mission? To fight for the rights of agricultural workers, many of whom were underpaid and mistreated by colonial plantation owners. What began as a movement for fair wages and better working conditions soon grew into something much larger. Gairy became a symbol of resistance against colonial rule. Charismatic and relentless, he rallied workers, led protests, and demanded change. His populist approach won him both fierce supporters and powerful enemies. By the mid-1950s, Gairy had transformed from a young activist to a serious political force, laying the foundation for a career that would define Grenada's modern history.
So Goose, tell me, so when you hear the name Eric Gairy, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that he bring us into independence, which at the time I didn't agree.
Mm.
I told you straight up, I demonstrated against it. But he was the victor.
He was the victor. Mm.
Yeah, he ended up victoriously, and our cousin came and lied to us. He did not give the true picture of what happened in England.
No, I never heard that story.
He came back with a different view, and then we was thinking that he didn't get independence, but when he came down victorious in Paul's Airport.
By the late 1960s, Eric Gairy had cemented himself as the dominant political force in Grenada. His populist appeal and relentless push for workers' rights led him to victory in multiple elections, making him the island's first chief minister and later premier under British rule.
And I am sure today that the heart of every true, honest, loyal, and patriotic Grenadian is throbbing exuberantly with joy, with happiness, and with thankfulness to the great supreme architect of the universe.
But Gairy had his eyes set on a bigger goal: full independence for Grenada. After years of negotiation and political maneuvering, he achieved his greatest milestone. On February 7, 1974, Grenada officially gained independence from Britain, with Gairy becoming its first prime minister. This was a defining moment in Grenadian history, marking the island's transition from colonial rule to self-governance. Gairy also developed strong ties with the United States, particularly during the administration of President Jimmy Carter. The U.S. saw Grenada as a potential ally in the Caribbean, and under Gairy's leadership, relations between the two nations remained stable. Domestically, his government focused on infrastructure, increasing wages, and improving access to education. Roads were built, schools expanded, and new social programs were introduced. On the international stage, he received recognition for his leadership, positioning Grenada as a newly independent nation with growing diplomatic influence. However, Gairy's political career wasn't without eccentricities. Perhaps most famously, he was deeply fascinated by UFOs and the supernatural, so much so that he brought the topic to the United Nations in 1978, urging world leaders to take the phenomenon seriously. His obsession with extraterrestrial life became a major talking point, with some seeing it as visionary, while others viewed it as bizarre and a distraction from governance. Regardless, Gairy's leadership was anything but conventional, and his name became synonymous with both progress and controversy. But as his power grew, so did resistance against him, and soon, the very people he once championed would rise against him. One of the most notorious aspects of his rule was the formation of the Mongoose gang, a feared paramilitary force loyal to Gairy. This group was accused of violently suppressing political opposition, intimidating critics, and even engaging in acts of brutality against those who spoke out against the government. Under Gairy's leadership, elections were marred by allegations of rigging and voter manipulation, leading to widespread unrest among the people.
And did you ever have any trouble with the Mongoose gang?
Yes, I did.
What?
The Mongoose gang was in my village, and when they come and bring news to Gairy, from my father, what my father used to stand up outside his shop, the property, and speak about what's going on in the country.
Mm.
And they used to go back and bring news to Gairy, to my father. And one of the people and them that used to bring news was right next to Gairy, and I was sat in our porch when Gairy and him was going out, and Gairy made a comment.
What he said?
I didn't know what he actually said, but he made a comment. Man, let me tell you something. One time Gairy come in the village, and while he was speaking in the village, the security or the secret police and the Mongoose gang or what, I say to them, I say, what's in place? They didn't hear what I say. They decided to chase after me, and I had to run for my life.
In the 1950s, the so-called Mongoose gang began not as a militia, but as a government-employed crew tasked with a very real problem: the island's growing rat infestation. Eric Gairy, then a rising political figure and advocate for rural workers, oversaw the recruitment of many of these men for the Mongoose Eradication Initiative. They were laborious, not enforcers. Over time, however, many of these workers developed a deep loyalty to Gairy. They weren't just employees, they were supporters who saw him as the only leader fighting for the poor and the working class. Some of this passion, tragically, spiraled beyond his control. In interviews, including one with the New York Times, Gairy distanced himself from violent acts committed in his name, condemning the gang's attacks. But as the violence escalated and political tensions intensified, the link between Gairy and the Mongoose gang became harder to deny. Whether fairly or not, guilt by association would become one of the most damaging stains on his legacy. One of Gairy's fiercest opponents was Maurice Bishop, leader of the New Jewel Movement, NJM, a socialist group that called for an end to Gairy's rule. The rivalry between the two intensified throughout the 1970s, with Bishop and his supporters accusing Gairy of ruling through fear and oppression. Protests against Gairy's government were often met with violence, further deepening divisions within Grenada. Then came January 21, 1974, a day now etched into Grenadian history as Bloody Monday. What began as a massive anti-government demonstration turned into chaos. Thousands had gathered to protest Gairy's leadership and call for constitutional reform. But the protest was violently broken up by police and alleged members of the Mongoose gang. Among the wounded and later the dead was Rupert Bishop, father of Maurice Bishop, who had been sheltering students in nearby. He was fatally shot while trying to protect them. The tragedy electrified the opposition. Maurice Bishop, already a rising voice against Gairy, became a national symbol of resistance overnight. And for many Grenadians, the events of Bloody Monday marked the point of no return, and protest began to tilt toward revolution. Another moment of controversy came in 1970 when Jennifer Hose Ten, a Grenadian contestant, won the Miss World pageant, the first black woman to ever do so. While this should have been a moment of national pride, allegations arose that Gairy, who was in London at the time, had influenced the judges to ensure her victory. The scandal cast a shadow over what was meant to be a groundbreaking moment in history and only fueled further criticism of Gairy's leadership. By the late 1970s, discontent with Gairy's government had reached a boiling point. On March 13, 1979, while Gairy was attending a United Nations meeting in New York, the NJM seized the opportunity and launched a bloodless coup, overthrowing his government. Bishop and his supporters quickly established the People's Revolutionary Government, marking the end of Gairy's reign.
And the revolution, my father predicted it. My father used to say to the village that if you treat a dog, your best friend, and you treat it time and time and again, he go turn back on you.
For real, for real.
Forced into exile, Gairy spent years away from Grenada, watching from afar as the island went through another period of upheaval, including Bishop's own downfall in 1983 and the subsequent U.S. invasion of Grenada, which removed the short-lived socialist regime. In 1984, after years in political exile, Gairy made an attempt to regain power, running in elections once democracy was restored. However, his influence had diminished, and his party never regained its former dominance. His final years were spent away from the political spotlight, and in 1997, he suffered a debilitating stroke that left him hospitalized. Eric Gairy passed away on August 23, 1997, leaving behind a complicated legacy, one that continues to spark debate among Grenadians to this day.
You may not have liked some of his policies, particularly in the later part of his life, but you could not help liking the person, to be around the person. And when you listen to the stories of James Mitchell and John Compton and the guys, Eugenia Charles, and they talk about Gairy and his flair and what he did, you really get to a sense of what this man achieved and what he did for our country.